Our next paper is Parents with an Unemployed Adult Child, Labor Supply, Consumption, and Saving Effects. Kathryn Edwards, and the discussion will be Stephanie Renome from RAND.
Both from RAND, actually. We should have coordinated, I realize, our presentations. We could have really done a slam dunk. But thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon. And of course, thank you so much for kind of staying to the end of today. I'm going to start kind of the introduction to this research by motivating it graphically. And this slide shows, or this graph rather, shows the distribution of unemployment among workers in the panel study of income dynamics. And so what it's basically counting is, if you look at everybody in this survey, at what age they become unemployed, and kind of tally up unemployment, how do we expect unemployment to be distributed by age? And we come up to a result that's very well known in the labor literature, which is that unemployment tends to be more common amongst young workers. In fact, about 60% of the unemployment I observe in the PSID occurs before age 30. Now there's lots of reasons as to why we think young people get unemployed more. It could be search, it could be job fit, it could be looking for certain matches of employers. But the reason why I think it's relevant today for a group that are talking about retirement security is that the PSID allows me to look at their parents. And so these are the ages of the kids, these are their moms. This distribution is centered around a different age. It's centered around age 55, which is the median age that a mother can expect to be when her adult child becomes unemployed. And so the relevance here, of course, is becoming obvious, right? That, I'm sorry, I guess I'm a young person explaining unemployment. Yeah. But 55 is a pretty critical age in terms of retirement security, right? It's when we think savings might hit the peak. It's when we think earnings might hit the peak. And so, you're having a separate strain on a household's budget sheet as they're nearing retirement that's coming from someone that they're related to. So I guess the nickname for this paper is, what is the cost of being the first national bank of mom? My mom told me to put that joke in. Okay. Oh, it's okay when she says it. So the reason why we look at this population of the unemployed adult children and their parents is because a lot of prior research has established the links between parents and children when there's an income shock among the child. Right, so I've looked at this in the panel study of income dynamics looking at receivers. Donald Cox and Megan Way have used a separate survey, the American Life Panel, to look at givers and receivers. And Kathleen McGarry has used the HRS to look at givers. And for taking these different approaches, looking at different population, different data sets, you find a pretty consistent result that there are financial assistance, or there is financial assistance provided to unemployed adult children in some way, shape, or form. So the question that we had, and which is relevant for retirement security, is, to what extent do parents adjust their behavior when a child is unemployed? And so I'll set this up kind of intuitively. You can imagine a single period budget constraint, right? I have to net out to the zero that I earn money, I consume things, and I save things, and those have to even out. And my kids are employed, and this is the world I live in. Now, one of them becomes unemployed, and I decide that I'm going to send this transfer, and I'm going to give them some assistance. So if you were just to net these out, on some kind of intuitive level, there's a change. There either has to be some kind of change in income, some change in consumption, or some change in savings that's going to support the sending of financial assistance to children. So what we wanted to look at in this paper was a pure empirical investigation into these deltas. Could we look at a set of mothers over time, see when their children become unemployed, and identify differences in either income or consumption or savings that we think is related to a child's unemployment? It's going to be a pretty difficult task. We don't have kind of the perfect data set that would have maybe their daily bank transactions as well as their savings account balances from an institutional source. We partly observe most of what we're looking at, but we do find pretty consistent results. And what I'll spend the rest of the time talking about is I'm going to go through each of these deltas. Here's how we define income, and here's what the change we're able to observe, and kind of lay out for you what we think that this financial assistance, what kind of effect it could have on mothers in or around retirement. And to give you a preview, we find results kind of across the board. We confirm that there are financial transfers sent to children. We find that there is a change, there's an increase in income, there's a decrease in consumption, and critically for this audience, we do find a decrease in savings. So I'll go through them one at a time, kind of explain how I define them and the relative size of the results, and then talk about maybe the research and policy implications of what that means. So I'm going to look in the PSID, as I've said, and I'll look at concurrently observed mothers and children. Now, the reason why we use mothers is simply by virtue of the fact that the match rate for fathers in the PSID is very low. And this is something that other researchers have told us is a problem in their own investigations of the PSID, so we're not quite sure how to treat this yet, but since it's a stronger match for the purposes today, we're looking at mothers. And we're going to divide them into 3 groups. We'll look at under 62, kind of the pre-retirement, 62 to 70 as the retirement window, and then older 70 as retired mothers. And probably most important to note in this respect, we're going to look at child's unemployment with a pretty strict definition in 2 ways. First, we're going to require that the child was working. So this isn't school exit. This isn't I graduated and I'm looking for my first job. This was I was working previously and then I experienced an unemployment spell from the labor force. The second requirement we make is that the children have to maintain their own household. So although there is a lot of attention paid to children living with their parents and co-residents being on the rise, we don't look at that population. In fact, we completely ignore them. We're only looking at separately maintained households between the parents and the children. But these are the spells that we're looking at. So this is a caveat of sorts to say that housing is a very large transfer, and I'm not saying anything about it or its cost. So what we'll do is relatively straightforward. I'm going to regress parent outcomes on the unemployment spell of the child, and I'm going to control for various changing and unchanging characteristics of the mom. So I think it's important to note that this really, similar to what James said, this isn't necessarily causal unless you think that a child's unemployment spell is random. So you can think of these as either kind of with no assumption, it's purely descriptive of this just happens to be the case that coincidental in the year of unemployment we see changes to the mom, versus if you think a child's unemployment spell is random, you can say that all of this is because the kid became unemployed. But for our purposes, we can't really make that claim kind of boldly. We need to make sure that we caveat it. So let's start with transfers. Do parents provide financial assistance? We're able to confirm what several other studies have found, that given just a unconditional sample average of $270 in any given time period, we expect mothers to send about $270 a year to their kid. The year of unemployment increases by $64. It's a relatively large percentage increase off of the mean, considering that around 70% will send 0 in any given year. We find that this is significant for all age groups of mothers, whether or not they're working in the retirement window or retired. So let's get to income. The way that we define income that's kind of changeable is through changes to labor supply, as well as changes to Social Security receipts. Probably what's missing that we could have looked at was food stamp participation, but that does have a pretty strict income requirement, and take-up is already relatively high, so we focus instead on Social Security and labor supply. What we found is that mothers who were working had an intensive increase in their labor supply. So we didn't see kind of homemakers entering the labor force when their child became unemployed. We saw already working mothers ratcheting up their employment by about 3.5 days off of a mean of 32 weeks per year. And again, this was only for the younger moms. We didn't see this in retirement or we don't see moms coming out of retirement. We see working mothers increasing their labor supply. For Social Security, it was kind of a different part of the population. We found that older mothers who were partnered and had not claimed Social Security by 65 saw a very slight uptick in Social Security receipt. This is kind of what we expected to find. I would be very dubious if it was a 62-year-old mother who has mixed labor force attachment sees an increase in claiming at 62 because of their kid. That would be kind of hard for me to believe, considering their own financial concerns are so pressing. But older mothers who have different resources, we see small changes to their Social Security receipt. So that's income. And this is why we say we have evidence of increased income in the year of a child's spell. The next would be consumption, which in the PSID is measured through usual household food consumption. Our sample average is around $11,000 a year, and we find that in the year of a child's unemployment spell, it drops by around $224. These are all the coefficients we estimate. This is significant for all age groups, but it's much larger for retired moms. right? Which, again, makes intuitive sense since they have fewer kind of levers to pull in terms of their income and savings. Lastly, for savings, this is kind of in the later time period that we have consistent measures, but we look at three things. The first is the percent of income that is contributed to a pension. The second is we kind of transform that into a dummy variable for whether or not they're contributing at all. And then finally, we look at asset values. And we have kind of farm and business income, just cash in your savings, or cash in your checking or savings account, real estate and other assets, as well as stock and vehicles. So what we find kind of varies by the age of the mom. For younger working moms who we had found that they increased their labor supply, we also find that they decreased their retirement savings. Off of a mean of around 0.7% of income contributed, we find a decline of negative 1.45. So it's a pretty large reduction in savings for that year. Interestingly, for mothers who are in the retirement window, we see an extensive increase. Right, so what we're finding, and these are a little bit hard to kind of think at the same time in your mind, but it looks like younger moms who are still working, they're working a little bit more and they're saving a little less, but moms who are no longer working are actually putting a little bit more towards savings. So there's a lot of ways to interpret that, which we don't have time to discuss kind of in every detail. I do apologize, I realize these are a lot of results to present very quickly, but it could be that parents kind of have changed their expectation of their kids and what they'll be able to provide or have to provide in the future. The last thing we see is a decrease in vehicle value. Vehicles are a liquid asset that's probably easier to convert to cash than maybe other things like a home, or maybe not opportunely timed like stock, and we find that there's about a $1,000 increase in vehicle value. So with the time that I have left, I wanted to point out a couple of research considerations. First, if you were keeping track as I was going through, you'll notice that what I identified for the financial assistance was much smaller than all of the results for consumption, savings, and income, right? By almost an order of magnitude. I found larger changes in behavior than I did for financial assistance. That's important because I think it points to really one of two things are occurring. First, that cash transfers, what we're able to measure in the survey, are just a small share of the assistance that parents provide to their children, right? There's in-kind transfers. You could give them a credit card that they charge to. You could pay their rent for them, right? There's many other kind of sources of assistance that we don't observe. But with our results, we could maybe estimate what share of all assistance is cash and come up with a bound for that. The second thing that could be occurring is what I mentioned previously, is that parents' behavior is not just used to finance these financial assistance, but parents are updating their beliefs about their kids. So if you were to, I guess this is kind of an awkward way to put it, but if you were to think of your kid as a dividend, it's going to pay off money in the future, you've updated your beliefs about maybe what their future potential is for you. And now you think not only are they not going to give me as much dividend, they might require more investment down the line. And so both of these things it could be that we're undercounting assistance, which I think we are. It could also be that they're adjusting their behavior based on expectations. And again, I think both are true. But if you think about what this means for, who's in this room and what it is we study, we're trying to talk via various research methods and various investigations to how to build a good safety net for retired households as they transition away from work. And what I'm trying to present the evidence of here today is that they themselves are building a safety net for a younger generation. So when we think about policy considerations, this and other research points to parental provision of an informal safety net. This is initial research. It's limited evidence, but I think there's a lot more work that can be done to show just how much this occurs and to what extent that it occurs and how important it is to children's households as well as parents. My second policy consideration would be that a lot of these changes are concurrent with dramatic changes to the safety net for the working age population. So at lunch, Peter Diamond told us that there hasn't been too many changes that have been successful to Social Security since 3 years before I was born, but there have been several changes to the safety net to working age adults in that time period. There's been changes to kind of an erosion to unemployment insurance, and a change in welfare reform, a change in the distribution of who receives Medicaid and food stamps, and whether or not we prefer in-kind versus cash benefits to the working age population. I don't really have the evidence here to make this kind of broad claim that these two are related, but I think that this is something that can be investigated further and can be determined if one of the kind of concerns for the well-being of retired households and the safety net geared towards retired workers is actually the lack of safety net of their children. And that's what we tried to get at through this initial evidence. Thank you.